The idea was Lucas's, of course. He was always the one with practical solutions to emotional problems. "A change of scenery will do him good," he said over breakfast one morning. I was staring at Ethan, who was barely touching his cereal, his thin frame hunched over the table, his eyes fixed on something far away, though I couldn't for the life of me see what it was. My heart ached every time I looked at him. It wasn't just that he was quiet or that he'd stopped playing with his friends. It was the way he seemed to drift further and further from us, like a balloon slipping out of a child's grasp. I didn't know how to pull him back. The hiking trail Lucas picked was about half an hour's drive from our house. It was a place we hadn't visited in years, an easy looping path through a patch of woods that bordered a small lake. The weather was perfect for it, crisp but sunny, with a light breeze that carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves. I packed sandwiches, water bottles, and a bag of trail mix Ethan used to love. He sat silently in the back seat during the drive, his face pressed against the window. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but he didn't meet my eyes. When we arrived, Lucas took the lead, pointing out little details to try to engage Ethan. An odd-shaped tree here, a squirrel darting through the underbrush there. Ethan trudged along behind us, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. It wasn't until we were about halfway through the loop that he stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed on something in the dirt. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. Ethan didn't answer, but he crouched down and picked it up. A stick, shaped like a perfect Y, its smooth surface glinting faintly in the sunlight. Lucas chuckled. "Looks like a slingshot without the band." I expected Ethan to drop it or toss it aside, but instead he held it tightly, turning it over in his hands like it was something precious. "I want to keep it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Lucas raised an eyebrow at me, but I shrugged. It was just a stick. If it made Ethan happy, even for a moment, what harm could it do? From that point on, Ethan carried the stick with him like it was an extension of his arm. He clutched it as we finished the hike, barely noticing the shimmering lake or the birds darting between the trees. At one point, he muttered something under his breath, and when I asked him to repeat it, he shook his head and walked faster. By the time we got back to the car, he was cradling the stick like a treasure. It felt like a small victory, even if I didn't understand it. At least he'd shown interest in something. That night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, I noticed the stick resting on his nightstand. It seemed strange, seeing it there, but I didn't say anything. I kissed him goodnight and turned out the light, hoping the day had done him some good. I told myself it was just a phase, a boy's harmless fascination with a random object. But deep down, I felt a flicker of unease I couldn't quite explain. As I stood in the hallway, looking back at his closed door, a chill crept up my spine. I shook it off and went to bed, not realizing that the stick wasn't just a phase. It was the beginning of something I couldn't yet comprehend. At first, the stick seemed harmless, even endearing. Ethan carried it everywhere, propping it on his lap during breakfast, tucking it under his arm when he brushed his teeth, and holding it as he curled up on the couch. Lucas and I exchanged a few amused glances, both of us assuming the novelty would wear off soon. But it didn't. If anything, his attachment to the stick grew stronger. He refused to let us touch it. One evening when Lucas jokingly reached for it, Ethan yanked it away so quickly that the motion knocked his plate of spaghetti onto the floor. "Don't!" Ethan shouted, his voice shaking. It was the first time in months he had shown any strong emotion, but it wasn't relief I felt. It was unease. The strange noises started about a week after the hike. At first they were faint, a tapping sound in the middle of the night that I dismissed as the creak of an old house. But then they grew louder. One night, I woke to what sounded like soft footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door. My heart thudded in my chest as I got up to check. The hallway was empty, but Ethan's door was ajar. I peeked inside to find him sitting up in bed, the stick clutched tightly in his hands. His eyes were wide and fixed on the far corner of the room. "Ethan?" I whispered. He didn't look at me. "It's okay, Mom," he said quietly, almost absently. "It can't get me if I have this." When I asked him the next morning about what he meant, he just shrugged and avoided my gaze. "It was a dream," he muttered, but the shadows under his eyes told a different story. Lucas brushed it off, saying kids had vivid imaginations and that I was worrying too much. But I knew my son. Ethan's imagination had always been lively. Yes, but never dark like this. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't explain, let alone fix. The kitchen became a strange sort of battleground. Late one night, I found Ethan there, standing by the sink with the stick in his hand. The room was bathed in the dim light of the stove's clock. His posture was rigid, his shoulders tense. "Ethan?" I called softly. He jumped, startled, and turned to face me. His face was pale, and he looked at me as if he didn't recognize me at first. I was thirsty," he stammered, though the glass of water in his hand was untouched. I guided him back to bed, my heart heavy with worry. As I tucked him in, I noticed the stick again, its surface oddly smooth, like it had been polished by constant handling. I wanted to ask him more about it, but something in his expression stopped me. Lucas was less patient. "He's just acting out," he said one evening as we sat in the living room. "Maybe it's his way of getting attention. Kids are weird, you know. He'll grow out of it." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't ignore the way Ethan had started whispering to himself when he thought no one was watching, or the way he seemed to be listening for something. Head cocked slightly, his eyes darting toward empty spaces. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just a phase. The breaking point came one night when I woke to a blood-curdling scream. My heart leapt into my throat as I bolted down the hallway to Ethan's room. He was sitting up in bed, clutching the stick so tightly his knuckles were white. His wide eyes darted around the room, filled with sheer terror. "It's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's trying to get in." I didn't know what "it" was, but I could feel the cold weight of his fear sinking into my own chest. I held him close, whispering soothing words I didn't believe, trying to convince both of us that everything would be all right. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be. Not anymore. The morning Ethan disappeared began like any other. I woke up to the soft hum of birdsong outside and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of calm, something I hadn't felt in weeks. But as I walked down the hall toward Ethan's room, the air seemed to shift, heavy and cold, carrying an unfamiliar silence that set my nerves on edge. His door was ajar, just enough for me to see his bed. It was empty. The sheets were rumpled, the pillow half on the floor, but Ethan wasn't there, and neither was the stick. I searched the house, calling his name as panic rose in my chest. "Ethan? Honey, where are you?" My voice echoed hollowly through the rooms. The bathroom was empty, as was the living room. I even checked the backyard, hoping he'd wandered outside. But there was no sign of him, not even his usual trail of scattered toys or books. When I ran back inside, Lucas was already on the phone, his voice calm but tight as he called the police. "We'll find him," he said to me. though I could see the worry etched into his face. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity. Neighbors gathered to help us search, their faces a mix of concern and pity. We combed through the woods near the hiking trail, retracing every step from that day weeks ago. I called Ethan's name until my throat felt raw, each unanswered shout cutting deeper into my heart. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. By the time we returned home, exhaustion had taken over, but I couldn't rest. That night, I sat in Ethan's room, surrounded by his things. His favorite blanket was still bunched up on the bed, and his collection of action figures lined the shelves. But the room felt lifeless, like a shell of the boy I knew. I found myself staring at the spot where the stick had been, the wood grain imprinted on the dust of the nightstand. It felt as though the object had left a scar, a reminder of something I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. Around midnight I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the storage room. At first I thought it was my imagination, but as I listened closer, the noise grew louder. It was a soft, steady tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. My pulse quickened. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. The storage room was at the end of the hallway, a place we rarely visited. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of darkness spilled into the hall. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response, but the tapping stopped. Swallowing my fear, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was a chaotic maze of boxes, old furniture, and forgotten trinkets. My flashlight's beam danced across the clutter, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then I saw him, Ethan, sitting on the floor in the far corner, clutching the stick. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's here." Before I could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and an unnatural stillness filled the air. A shadow began to stretch across the floor, darker than the rest, shifting and twisting as it moved toward us. I froze, unable to look away. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something alive, something wrong. Ethan clung to the stick, his knuckles white. "Don't let it touch you," he said, his voice barely audible. My instincts kicked in, and I moved toward him, but the shadow surged forward, its shape twisting into something almost human. Almost. The next moments were a blur of panic and chaos. The shadow lashed out, its edges sharp as blades, and I felt a searing pain across my arm. I pulled Ethan close, shielding him as best I could, but the thing kept coming, relentless and hungry. Ethan raised the stick, pointing it at the shadow, and for a moment it recoiled, as if the wood itself burned it. The room filled with an ear-splitting screech, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The air grew warm again, but the silence that followed was deafening. I clutched Ethan tightly, my heart pounding in my chest. He was trembling, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't let go of the stick. I didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I woke up in the hospital, the sharp scent of disinfectant mixing with the dull ache in my arm. The gashes left by that thing in the storage room had been cleaned and bandaged, though the pain lingered, a reminder of just how real it all was. Lucas sat beside me, his hand gripping mine tightly. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "Ethan," I croaked, my throat dry and raw. "Where is Ethan?" Lucas's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's okay," he said, though his voice wavered. "A neighbor found him walking down the road early this morning. He had the stick with him. He's at home now, resting." Relief and confusion washed over me in equal measure. I wanted to see him, to hold him and make sure he was safe, but my body felt too heavy to move. Lucas leaned closer, his voice low. "What happened in that room? The police found the place a wreck, and you were unconscious on the floor." He paused, his eyes searching mine for answers. I didn't know what to tell him. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? Back home, Ethan seemed different. He was quieter, but not in the distant, withdrawn way he had been before. Now his silence felt heavy, deliberate, as though he were carrying a secret too big for his small frame. The stick never left his side, and he flinched if anyone came too close to it. I watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes darted to corners of the room, as if he were expecting something to emerge. When I tried to talk to him about the storage room, about the thing we'd seen, he shook his head violently. "Don't talk about it, Mom," he whispered. "Talking makes it stronger." Lucas insisted we seek help, and I agreed, though part of me doubted a therapist could do anything about the horrors we'd faced. We found a child psychologist who specialized in trauma, someone warm and understanding who didn't press Ethan too hard. I sat in on the first few sessions, my chest tightening every time he mentioned the stick. "It keeps me safe," he told the psychologist one afternoon, his small hands gripping it tightly. "Without it, it will come back." The psychologist glanced at me, her brow furrowed with concern, but she didn't push him further. As the days turned into weeks, the house seemed to settle back into a kind of uneasy normalcy. The strange noises stopped, and the oppressive cold that had seeped into the walls was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. At night, I'd lie awake, listening for the faint tapping sound that had once haunted our halls. My dreams were filled with shadows, shifting and twisting, always just out of reach. And then there was the stick. I hated it, hated the way it seemed to anchor something dark in our lives. But I couldn't bring myself to take it from Ethan, not after what I'd seen. One evening, I found myself standing outside the storage room, my hand resting on the doorknob. The door had been repaired, though I couldn't bring myself to open it again. The memory of that night was too fresh, too raw. Lucas had wanted to clear the room out, to turn it into something useful, a home office maybe, or extra storage. But I'd refused. "Leave it," I'd said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. He didn't argue. The stick now rests in a locked chest in Ethan's room. He insisted on keeping it there, though he rarely opens the chest. Sometimes, late at night, I hear him whispering through the door, his voice soft and steady, as though he's talking to someone, or something. I don't ask him about it anymore. I'm not sure I want to know. And then there are the whispers, faint and fleeting. They come in the dead of night, just as I'm drifting off to sleep. They're soft, almost imperceptible, but they're there. I tell myself it's my imagination, the lingering effects of trauma. But deep down, I know better. The stick may have kept it at bay, but it's not gone. Not really. Some nights I find myself staring at the chest, wondering what would happen if I opened it. But I never do. Instead, I lie awake, waiting for the day it comes back, because I know it will.